be that you think you're the only one in your neighborhood, your area, your community. I encourage you to get on the AREDNmesh.org website. They have a forum there if you have interest in it. We also have a Virginia AREDN Group IO. You get on there, it's of course less traffic, but it's all basically Virginia based. That'll kind of give you an idea. And if you're there, you get on that site, you're in a community, you don't know if anybody's around, put it on there. We're all reading that, and if we hear stuff, we're trying to push people's information back and forth. It's all about sharing to learn to grow this mesh network. So with that, I'm going to give you to Dave, WA4POE, OPE. I thought he was powered over Ethernet, but he didn't have his cable. So Dave's going to fill you in.
He always gets that wrong. As I said, I'm Dave Hewlett, WA4OPE. Actually, Daryl and I are both AECs for Newport News, so this is kind of near and dear to our hearts as far as a technology. What we're going to talk about, we're not going to talk about all this, but this is kind of an idea of a lot of the stuff that you're going to have to be worrying about, concerned about if you're going to go down this. Okay? There is a lot, but as Daryl said, there are a lot of resources available out there. How many have heard of mesh? Okay. All right. It's actually been in QST, I think once or twice, and it's really something that's becoming almost a staple in emergency management. So, real quick, what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce kind of an overview of what mesh is, and then we're going to take a look at the real world, which is where Mark's going to come in. So what is a mesh network? In its simplest form, it's ham internet. And in reality, most anything that you can do on the internet, you can do in some way, shape, or form on a mesh net. Okay? It is a self-discovering, so the nodes that you put up, they'll find each other as long as they're on the same frequencies. And it will automatically route traffic and essentially self-heal as issues come along. It's fault tolerant. It automatically reconfigures as nodes join and or leave the system. So you can have a power outage at a node in your system, and as long as it's not like a choke point, a key, then the system will figure out how to reroute. The routers will actually talk to each other and reroute. And when it comes back on, it just joins the fray. So in that example there, F dropped out for some reason. Well, if it comes back, it will say, hey, I'm back online, and it'll talk to the folks closest to it, and it's back in the network. Resources on any node can be shared by any node. Okay? As an example, downstairs, if you come to the table, and that's what, as Daryl said, any questions you got that we don't answer here, you can come down there. Knowledgeable people, much more knowledgeable than me, down there. But right now, we actually have a camera at one of the other booths in the venue down there, and we're linked to it over the mesh back to our corner. So you can do video, you can share a server, file server. You can do VoIP, which we also have set up down there. A lot of things are available as long as if it's tied to a node, you can share it out and everybody can use it. Essentially, each node is a router. We flash off-the-shelf hardware to do this. Each node builds routing tables to track which nodes are currently connected to the mesh and enable the routing of messages back and forth. So it figures out what's going on. If you have an endpoint out there that can't be seen from one location, but other nodes can see it, it will figure out how to get the traffic there automatically. And we talked about that. So why do it? Well, we live in a digital world. Cell phones, tablets, Our kids are using technology that would have been considered witchcraft, not long ago. And the people that we deal with in our volunteer positions, especially in emergency management, they live in a digital world. Okay? So if you're trying to move information around, it's like, we need it now. We need it now. And trying to do that, and not that voice is not a viable mode, it is. It's been helpful for years. It's nothing like being able to talk. Okay? But some information is just better if it's on a form or something that can easily move back and forth with information. So electronic mail is another big thing that we can do. High-speed data is a norm, not the exception in our world today. So where did this start? Well, it started with some folks down in Texas, right? They started experimenting, and off-the-shelf routers, most of them today use what operating system? Linux, okay? So Linux, for a lot of people, translates to I can hack it. And in fact, most of the routers today, if you go into the setup, there's a place to update the firmware. Well, guess what? They started messing around with some of the old WRT45s, okay, on 2 gig. Got basically rewrote the firmware to do this type of data management. And an interesting thing with the 2 gig band, under Part 15 rules, which is where everybody lives in their normal Wi-Fi router, okay, but there's also Part 97 where we operate, just a little bit below. The unfortunate thing, though, is that old Linksys stuff, the radios weren't designed to go down the road. But there is off-the-shelf hardware from Ubiquiti, TP-Link, and several others that does. And so another group, Amateur Radio Data Network, they took it a little bit further, and not only do we have 2.4 gig, which is what we show here, but we have these other 2 bands. Actually, there's 3 more. For some reason, 900 is not shown on the AREDN, but it is available. Okay. So we have the 2.4 gig, which I talked about. We also have 3.4 and 5.8. Now, some of you may also have read, and this is something that we need to be concerned about in the community, is that there are commercial ventures that want to impede or intrude onto the 3 and the 5 gig bands. Because, like I say, we live in that digital world. We have this great 5G that they've been talking about for what, a decade? And maybe we'll get it here sometime, I don't know. Okay? But the companies that are, the cell phone companies are wanting that extra bandwidth so that they can stream all this data to our handy little devices. And so there is talk in the FCC of either taking away or severely impacting our frequency spectrum in these 2, which essentially will potentially cause issues with already established networks. So some uses of mesh, as I said, email, keyboard chatting, file transfers to streaming video, voice over IP, web applications, even WebEOC, I guess you could run over this. Contesting, a lot of different stuff is available if you can configure it, get it set up, connected. The one thing you especially have to be careful, though, is HTTP versus HTTPS. Okay. You cannot use S. It's encrypted. That pretty much means we can't use that over our frequency. We can't pass encrypted traffic. And HTTPS would be encrypted. Okay? So we have to stay within the bounds of the FCC Part 97 regulations. So you might ask, how does mesh network function in the real world? Well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark, and we can get an example of that.
Is that good? Okay. All right, let me exit out of this here. Okay, here we go. Okay. All right, thank you, Dave. Okay, everybody can hear me? Good. Okay, all right, I'm Mark, and the call sign Whiskey Alpha 4 Kentucky Fried Zucchini, just to make it easier to remember. Okay. Because I actually have sent cards in, and I actually got a card back, and somebody wrote KFC on it. Very insulting, very insulting. Okay. Anyway, there has been a tremendous amount of interest in AREDN, not just like on the West Coast and other areas here, but especially on the East Coast as well. A lot of work that has been going on here in the Virginia area are people trying to build out infrastructure. They're trying to build backbone nodes. They're trying to put in some nodes at critical places, EOCs, hospitals, other advantageous places. So that's building out infrastructure. The topic here that I have is talking about what I'll call a tactical deployment. This is an example of starting from square one and setting up something for an event, an example of what you can do, what some of the limitations are, and also why you would like to have infrastructure in place if at all possible here. So last year, I did a brief introduction to the AREDN work that we did at the Marine Corps Marathon. The AREDN work that we're doing is basically in support of the Marine Corps Marathon activities. We are trying to do this to switch over from some of the existing equipment we've been using. In the past, we've been using the ICOM ID1s that only run at 128 kilobits a second and 9600 baud packet. All right, so if that gives you any historical perspective as to where we are. All right, the motherhood and apple pie stuff here. So the Marine Corps Marathon is now the 6th largest marathon in the U.S. here. One of the key things is it is called the People's Marathon because it's open to all participants. When you get into some of the other higher class marathons, you actually have to go through some qualifications. All right, here you can just pay your entry fee and run. So it's actually become a very good starting point for people that want to run marathons at a higher level here. But it's also been a great community activity for the National Capital Region. So they have about 30,000 runners and about 70,000 people standing along the race course cheering them on. One of the things that is unique about this is, unlike the other marathons that they usually contract out services or they rely on police and fire departments to run any of their emergency communications, at the Marine Corps Marathon, the Marines and the Navy corpsmen are responsible for the medical services. The hams are responsible for the communications. So this is one thing that is very nice, is that you actually have this really good interrelationship between the military and the ham community here. The other thing is they treat this event also for training purposes as a planned mass casualty event. And they even bring in med students from some of the other medical schools, I believe up in Philadelphia and a couple other places. And they bring them in to get them used to what it's like in something that would be akin to a mass casualty event. One of the other things that really complicates activities for the Marine Corps Marathon is that you're going through two jurisdictions. You're going through the District of Columbia and you're running into Virginia as well. There are multiple counties, there are multiple jurisdictions, multiple police entities. All right, it's a very complicated environment. And as you can imagine, also being in the nation's capital, the security levels and concerns are also much higher. So it's a big deal in coordinating with everybody. The reason they want hams involved is that the hams operate off infrastructure. The thing that they're always concerned about is somebody's going to say there's something bad happening, and they call 911, and they could be hitting a tower in Arlington, Virginia, when the incident is actually in DC, or the people don't know how to coordinate. They want any emergency communications and that information to get centralized, moved up to a unified command center. They have representatives from all the different police and fire agencies right there. They dispense the messages and they know how to respond. Okay. So, two things that hams do is we are the eyes and ears on the race course. So there are people just on the race course with HTs and mobile rigs in their cars. But the hams also do the data entry into the runner database. So when runners come into an aid station, we're the ones doing the data entry through our ham network, all right? And the Navy corpsmen are the people doing the medical services, plus some volunteers that they bring in. Okay, so a very brief overview. We wanted to introduce AREDN because, like I said, ID1s are obsolete now. There really wasn't any other good solutions. Packet is very slow. So what we ended up doing in 2018 was just a basic test that's being done in parallel with all the existing equipment. So there are 5 medical stations that start from the finish line. Make sure my audio is not cutting out. Just want to make sure the audio is not. Right. Still there? Okay. All right, it seems like when I'm turning away, it's going away. Okay, anyway, so we have 5 medical stations that they operate here that go from the finish line over to the Roslyn Metro Station. And the reason they're distributed in a line like this is people limp across the finish line and they'll collapse. All right. So they'll have a med station there, and as people start going along, they'll start dropping like flies. All right. And you finally get to the bitter end here where people say, oh, that was fun. I had such a good time at the race. They go down to the metro, go to catch the subway. All right. They got to pull them out of the subway station, go get aid for them. So what we did in 2018 was just this daisy chain here between the various medical stations. So I call this the longest 0.6 mile link because everything was done at ground level. So one station had to see the other, and do this daisy chain along there. Well, it worked well. And one of the key things that we learned was that as you got down into where the Roslyn Metro Station was and you enter this one kind of like party area that they call Dark Star Park, I didn't name it, that's what they call it, where they have beer and food and other things like that. As you're starting to get into that area, you're going into something akin to an urban canyon. You have buildings and other obstacles that you got to work around here. So we learned a lot about what it takes to be able to operate in an urban canyon and also up on the area we call the hill, which is where the Iwo Jima Memorial is at the finish line here. So anyway, we learned a lot about that. We also found that some of the older AREDN gear is also becoming so limited with some of the newer AREDN builds that we're recommending that people stop using the older AREDN gear and go to the newer equipment here. So a lot of valuable lessons were learned in 2018. Okay, so this year's goal was to cover the race course. All right. Then I go to the first briefing and they said, by the way, they've expanded the marathon and we added this thing now, this leg that went over here to what they call the ultra marathon to make it a 50K race. Okay. Okay, well, we didn't know about that in our planning here, so we said, well, guess what? We're not going to support you this year, okay, with the 50K race. So we'll get to you next year. Instead, what we said was we're going to try and cover as much of the race course as possible, all right, for the real marathon here. Okay, One of the things I like to do is, rather than just flounder, I like to set some metrics, okay, that people know how to stay focused on what we're going to do. And I said, all right, this is our first time covering the race course. Let's just try and keep focused on the mission here. Let's not get pulled off into tangents. So I said, let's just see if we can get 75% of the stations to connect to the network, just dial tone. And then let's see if 50% of the people can actually go in through an AREDN node and actually get to the database. All right, just start simple. So one of the key things that we were concerned about was having adequate coverage over the race course. As you know, Washington, D.C. used to be a swamp. Okay, little has changed over the years. But the surrounding areas are at a higher elevation. All right, so we take advantage of the fact that you have some areas that are higher elevation that we wanted to try and provide coverage down into the District of Columbia area, the mall, basically. All right, where the majority of the race is here. So to ensure that we were going to have coverage, we wanted to have some overlapping sectors, all right, that just looked out over the race course so that you don't run into a situation where one person's on the course, but they're blocked because of a building. You know, maybe if they can find another station that's over at a different angle, they can hit that station. So we wanted that overlap in there. As I said, we wanted to leverage all the lessons learned about what we did in 2018. Okay. And like I said, we wanted to just give the aid stations the information that says, find your best sector. Okay. So in the end, we ended up standing up 3 sector nodes. Somebody was able to work a swell deal with the Smithsonian American History Museum. You know, it's one of those things where somebody knows somebody who knows somebody kind of thing. And at the last minute, we actually put in a sector node lower down, but it was on top of the roof of the American History Museum there. So we had the DoubleTree Hotel is in Crystal City. That's been our primary node for ID1s, other equipment for years and years and years. So we set up a node there. We also worked out a deal with the Arlington Courthouse in Arlington, Virginia that overlooks the race course. All right. The beauty of the DoubleTree and the Arlington Courthouse arrangement was that the 2 sectors were at 90 degrees to each other. So we had a really good coverage pattern by having that arrangement. The Smithsonian one, part of it was just building a relationship with them, and it helped infill things closer down to the mall itself. So it actually worked out well for being able to do this. So looking at the planning here, in these coverage maps, the light blue is good. As you start getting to dark blue and pink, those are examples of where you start having dropouts in coverage here. So if you'll notice, there are actually disparities in coverage between 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz here, but you definitely begin to see the effects of terrain. There are a number of areas in the DC area that you will find that the elevation as you get near the Potomac River, the elevation drops dramatically, and you'll end up being shadowed because somebody's down in a hole. So the Arlington Courthouse, like I said, was coming in 90 degrees to that. Now the propagation says, this is wonderful, I can see everything. Now you know the reality is that doesn't take into account trees, it doesn't take into account every single building or every other obstacle. But this at least said that between the 2 configurations here, I stood a very good chance of being able to provide really good coverage. Okay, so here's a picture of the sectored antenna systems that we ran at the DoubleTree. If you look down here, you can actually see the Pentagon. Okay, so we have the 5 gig and the 2.4 gigahertz nodes. The black boxes here contain 18 hour sealed lead acid batteries and an AC power supply. So we had extension cords that went back to an outlet. And then we just used the diode OR configuration. So if the AC power dropped out, then the battery was going to run the node. All right, just a very simple arrangement like that. The 2 nodes were linked together. All right, you can do what they call a device-to-device or DTD connection. So we could bring the 2 nodes together, just hook them up very simply. We also kind of cheated a little bit. One of the guys at the last minute was able to bring in a cellular modem. and we plugged that in, used a little smart switch for doing routing. So we could then also go in through the cell network and manage the network here. Okay. So here's a shot here. This is just kind of looking out, for the azimuth angle. Okay, and you're seeing the Washington Monument. This is that kind of tall white stick over yonder here. Okay, so the other node, because of the availability of the equipment we had at the moment when we were rushing to get a lot of things set up, we only had a 5 gigahertz node up on the Arlington Courthouse, hoping to add a 2 gigahertz node next year for the operation. So we have the sector node was stood up here. This was something, thankfully, we didn't have to haul the cinder blocks. They were already on the roof of the building. Boy, was I thankful. Okay. But, we set this whole thing up in probably 45 minutes. From the time we had to haul the stuff up to this roof area, you spend more time going through and getting access to the building, getting to the person who has the badge, who takes you to this, that gets you to the badge, that has the elevator, that gets you to the whatever. Okay. So all told, I think it took us about 45 minutes to stand this node up. All right, piece of cake. So this is the view of this node looking down onto the mall here. So you see the Lincoln Memorial, you see the Washington Monument, the Capitol's back here, and if you look very carefully, you'll see a lot of hot air kind of emitting right around here. Okay. Ripple waves, yeah, it's an atmospheric distortion. Yeah, so. Okay. So on the Smithsonian, like I said, we were able to just quickly jump in there. You're smiling, I guess. Yes, you took that picture. Okay. So this is a 2 gigahertz sectored antenna, and this is a 5 gigahertz panel antenna. And this is pointing back towards Crystal City, where the DoubleTree Hotel is here. This also was providing additional infill coverage down on the mall, as they call it, which is the long strip of grass and streets and everything that goes from the Lincoln Memorial all the way down to the Capitol. So, like I said, and also we operated this solely on battery and a solar panel. We didn't want to intrude and make things more complicated, so we didn't ask for AC power. It's enough of an issue just getting onto any federal building to be able to do this. When they said, if you want to get on the roof, they're like, well, hold on, we need to call security. Well, who's security? Well, they have to coordinate with the White House, okay, to make sure that we don't look like snipers, okay, going up on roofs and stuff like that. So there's a lot of that kind of coordination that goes on in the Washington area. Okay. Take a sip of water. Okay, so we set up the infrastructure. The runner database vendor that the Marine Corps had been using for many, many years, for whatever reason, they dropped the relationship with them. And they went to this other company that provides what I'll call a race-in-a-box solution for being able to register people, send them the bids, send them the information, and all this kind of stuff. So they have this whole front end for pulling the people in. They added a section to the site there for being able to have medical information. Who's your point of contact? Are there any things that we need to know? What's your address? Things like that. So we can have the medical information also in the database. So the thing is, this new database vendor, as is typical with everybody now, all of this data sits out on the cloud. All right, it does not run on a local server. Now, I wish it did, but we don't control that. So what that means is you have to have access to the internet to get to the runner database. The internet connection is managed by the Marine Corps. Their connections came in through one of two paths. It either came in through 3 T1 lines that are what they call bonded together, so you only have about 4 megabits a second of capacity, or as a backup, they have a satellite link, all right, that on a good day with the wind at your back can get you up as high as 25 megabits a second, but it's actually not advertised as having capacity that high. I believe it's only listed at somewhere between 5 and 10 megabits per second, I think is the advertised rate. So the Marine Corps manages the internet connection side of the business here. We connect into their switch, to our AREDN equipment here. We're out onto the network, and away we go. All right. So what we set up on our AREDN side here was, and Ed, you can raise your hand, okay. Did a very nice job, stood up a bunch of Raspberry Pis in a very cute configuration here. He stood up a network time protocol server so everybody could get the time on their computers. There was a Citadel chat server, okay, so we could do some IM. We even set up as a test a Raspberry PBX, okay, so we could do Asterisk communications. And because the database sits out on the internet and operates HTTPS, we ended up standing up a reverse proxy server to basically just do the address translation and protocol translation. So everything moving on the AREDN network is HTTP, so it's unencrypted, and we use the reverse proxy as our means of getting out to the HTTPS traffic on the internet there. Now, so worked well until. So first of all, the Marine Corps, let's put it this way, AREDN runs so fast, the data rates are so fast, we crashed the Marine Corps network. Okay, so we have defeated the U.S. military. All right. So basically, their service has been so limited for so long because all they used to run were IP phones, all right, that they couldn't handle it. When we had ID1 traffic, you only ran at 128 kilobits a second. That's only the equivalent of like roughly 2 phones. All right. So all of a sudden we come in with this vacuum cleaner called AREDN, all right, and we crash their router. On top of that, their router hadn't been updated for years because they figured worked last year. Right? So then they said, okay, let's try and move you to the satellite link. So they put us on the satellite link, and everything was working just fine until we had a torrential downpour. Okay, satellite link went down. Okay, so we had a whole lot of fun working around these issues on the race day. Okay, just moments before the race occurred here. The good news, the AREDN network ran. The bad news, we're going to have a whole lot of work this year with the Marine Corps in doing practice runs, okay, to make sure that we don't have a repeat of this issue again, okay? But like I said, they weren't prepared, their systems were old, all right, and I think we really kind of showed them up. Okay, one of the key things is because the Marine Corps is responsible for providing the internet connection, we had to get the internet connection fed into the AREDN network. So what we ended up doing was the AREDN network, for the people out on the race course, they operated on 5 gigahertz on channel 180. We set up a link that ran from where the Marine Corps connection is and passed that along on another 5 gigahertz channel, channel 171. And we relayed that through a relay node that beamed up to the Arlington Courthouse. So that's basically how we fed the internet connection, okay, out to the whole arrangement here. So, picture of this, the hill, as they call it, is just beyond the tree line here. This is one of the medical stations along the way, Med Charlie. So we daisy changed from their hill location over to Med Charlie here, and just to give you an idea for your configuration, these are 2 AREDN nodes stuck on a paint pole. Okay, there's a battery because it had been raining in the morning. We stuck the battery underneath the bridge here. This is just a bridge going across the road here. So you have the directional antenna is pointing back to the Arlington Courthouse, and there's a smaller node on here that's pointing back here to the Med Charlie station. Okay. So this, if you look very carefully in between the circle, is where the courthouse location is. So we had to kind of thread the needle here for being able to do this link. So this is the other side of the equation. So basically, if you're up on the courthouse and you look down, that bridge that we're looking at is here. So it's a tight squeeze, okay? So this says it's important that you do your site surveys and you do propagation surveys ahead of time, or have the flexibility of being able to move around to different places. This also shows you the complexity of what it's like to work in an urban environment. Okay. Okay, so out on the race course, an example. Raise your hand.
Oh, hi.
Okay, hi. So this is Brendan Kane for HRR. So this was pictures he sent me of his configuration here. So his directional antenna was pointing back towards the Smithsonian in this case, okay, which again tied into the network. And he was helping out some people at an aid station that's on the other side of the mall because they had some equipment problems. So he ended up providing a link over to them. All right. So he was able to provide their connection and then in turn provide the connection back up to the larger mesh network here. This was basically his operating station. This little box here is called a HAP AC light. It operates 2.4 gigahertz into the mesh network, operates 5 gigahertz for normal civilian Part 15 operations here. Okay, one of the busiest tents or med stations is Med Alpha. Med Alpha is the tent where when runners are in severe distress, they either have significant falls, they need hydration, people have heat stroke. Right? We have tents that Med Alpha is really intended. It's kind of the primary medical tent here. So there's a dominance of operators the operators in this case are Navy corpsmen. All right? They're the ones that we were providing services for. So what we had was a sectored antenna that was outside of that tent going back to the rest of the hill location where the Marine Corps system is. Brought that in, did our link over here, and again we just did these direct wire connections to do this configuration. So you're on channel 171, fed that all the way over to that relay node, everything goes out on channel 180, came back down again here. We also did interconnections in here and used one of these little HAP AC light devices here at 5 gigahertz, and all of the corpsmen who were doing the data entry their laptops were communicating on 5 gigahertz on just Part 15, and we were providing the service for them for the connection. Okay. So there was an issue at one point because of the Marine Corps switch that they had that, oddly enough, things became so disjointed at one point. You remember at the DoubleTree Hotel, I mentioned there was a cell modem that was located up there for management. In the end, we ended up pulling all the internet service through that cell modem, through the AREDN network, okay, so that the corpsmen could do their data entry. All right. So this is a picture on the outside. So Med Alpha is right at the Iwo Jima Memorial itself here. This was the sectored antenna that was pointing back towards their hill location. Then they have these feather flags, to indicate where all the medical stations are here. This is a picture that was taken near the end of the race, which is why you have so many people standing around. During the peak of the race, all the medical personnel are running around like crazy. They are very, very busy dealing with people, triaging people, everything else. So here, this was basically near the end of the race. Things had calmed down. And the corpsmen were just, at the end here, just doing the data entry and just mopping up the paperwork, if you will. Okay, so how did we do? I said, let's see if we can get 75% of the stations onto the AREDN network, and let's get 50% of them connected to the database. So we did meet our goal. This was a good learning lesson. You got to understand, we're out there, you're setting up at 2 o'clock in the morning. You want to guess when it started raining? 2 o'clock in the morning, okay? So you're in the dark, and it's raining, and you're trying to get things configured, and for a lot of people using the AREDN gear out on the network, on the race course, this was their first go at it, all right? So that's why I said, we knew there were going to be issues. And really what you ended up with were cases where people thought, yeah, I got the equipment or whatever, and they found they were either in a bad location, and they know that next year they got to find a better location. Or they said, oh yeah, I'll have it all set up, and then they get there and they're like, how do you set that up again? So you got to get your stuff prepared. You got to run through and do some practice sessions before you show up here. So we had a couple of cases like that. Like I said, there were some equipment problems, operator things. But by and large, everybody was able to hook up their stuff, get into the network, okay, and do their business. If people did not connect into the database, even though they were able to connect into the AREDN network, usually it's because they were busy doing data entry and they didn't want to stop what they were doing. So some stations ended up switching over to like personal hotspots at one point, and they didn't have the time because they're so busy doing entry. So they just said, well, I'm going to stop. And they just let the AREDN stuff run, but they didn't actually do the data entry over the AREDN network. So again, if things were better set up, I think at the beginning here, you would have seen almost everybody running through the AREDN network. We really, in terms of terrain, we're limited. One of the stations, A23, sits down in a hole in a place called Rock Creek Park. It's a very scenic drive, very pretty. But if you look at the terrain, elevation drops like a rock there. So either you need a really tall mast, or you got to find some other places that you can try and relay back out. So one of my homework assignments for this year is to start doing some surveys and see if I can find some places to be able to relay out of there. All right. Without looking too conspicuous and without having the Park Service, declare me a terrorist or whatever. Okay. The other thing is we took 850 off the planning here because, like I said, it was a new station. We don't even know what they need, so we just said we're not going to revector everybody and everything here until we know exactly what it is they need for service there. We thought actually they would need less service because the people who run ultra marathons generally are people who are in tip-top shape. They know how to run a marathon. Okay, it would be extremely rare that anybody at that level of competition is going to really need, service. Okay, so again, that was our goal. Okay, so what did we learn? Key thing I like to point out is, because we're doing a tactical deployment, the Marine Corps Marathon as an activity is an excellent AREDN test bed. If you really want to come out, learn how to do things in a tactical setup, really be able to get a feel for what it's like to do AREDN in a real environment, this is a great place to do it. Okay, AREDN works well in this environment. One of the key lessons, for people was we're very used to having our radios on UHF or VHF sitting right next to us. All right, but with AREDN stuff, you got to have a decent link back to the site. So you better plan on having either long Ethernet cables to move your node, to an advantageous spot, or you want to actually look at trying to do some sort of a wireless arrangement to your AREDN node. So operate your AREDN node on some sort of a battery or a remote power source, put that away from your operating station, and just link over to your AREDN node. All right. So again, somebody could be sitting under a tree somewhere because that's where a tent was deployed or whatever, but the advantageous shot may be sitting on a bridge that's 100 feet away. All right. So you got to start thinking about things in that mindset. Survey the locations ahead of time. Washington, D.C., it's a very pretty city, but you really have to walk the beat to find all the little nooks and crannies and little places that you can do things here. And again, especially if you're going to do this at dark 30 in the rain, all right, it's nice to know where you are and what you're going to do, all right, because when you're out on the race course, you don't have the luxury of being able to set up the day before, all right. All the roads, everything is open to the public, they don't even set up the tents, okay, until, basically the early morning. So you don't have the luxury of being able to say, yeah, we'll get it all set up and running or whatever, okay? You're going in the dark and having to do your work. Highly recommend getting those miners headlights, okay, for your work here. The other thing is, a lot of people think, well, I'm going to buy a node and I'm going to have so much gain and put so much power into the network, all right, that I'm going to guarantee that I got a link. Well, as you know with antennas, power doesn't come for free, all right? There's power and then there's gain. So antenna gain means that your beam width is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. You're concentrating your energy into a very small beam width. Downside of that is that it assumes that the mast that you have or your other mounting configuration is very stable, because you can have a very small beam, and if your mast is blowing around in the wind, okay, guess what? You're not getting into the network. So think about using either lower gain nodes that have a broader antenna pattern, or really start thinking about what is your mast configuration here. Because like I said, a lot of people have gotten used to using masts that they only use for VHF and UHF antennas, and they think, yeah, I'll take this, MFJ, carbon fiber thing and run it up here, and put my node up there, and it goes flopping around in the wind. So you got to think about the physical deployment aspect of this. Okay, so next year, what are we going to do? Well, I want to complement by adding a 2 gigahertz sector on top of the courthouse. So I want everything to run with both 2 and 5 gigahertz so that people have the maximum options for being able to have equipment out on the course here. I want to have some practice sessions, and I want to get the number of connected stations up higher. All right, like I said, there was a lot of lessons learned. A lot of people skinned their knees, and that's fine. So our goal is to get everybody else running here. So we want to take it up a notch here. Like I said, my homework assignment is to see if I can serve this one site that is sitting down in a hole. Okay. One nice thing about AREDN is, even if you can't do a connection, if the AREDN network is connected to what they call a tunnel connection, you can actually come in through the internet and actually come into the AREDN network proper. So let's say I'm not going to find a decent spot. If I've only got one station, I could tell them, you know what, you're going to be the lone child that's going to operate off of a cellular modem, a hotspot or whatever, but you can tunnel in and get to everything else that we're doing here. So there is the possibility of that. So that's one of the things that we're going to be working on this year. The other is, after a debrief, I want to find out how much or how little service they need for the aid station here. Okay, so again, we had a lot of really good dedicated volunteers. A lot of people are very eager to dump using the ID1s. The packet stuff runs so slow that basically now when you're dealing with a modern database that was written as a cloud service, written by people who think that the whole world is as if you're sitting at home with your 50 to 100 megabit per second connection, all right, and then you try and explain to them, it's like, no, our data pipe is like a soda straw. And they look at you like, why would you do that? Okay, so, you have to kind of like educate them. They tried standing up a telnet connection at the last minute. They didn't provide enough of the backup information to us ahead of time to do anything with it. And it's typical, like one of the things is they had one character that started off as a delimiter for the telnet connections, and they used like a tilde. And the only problem is that apparently is some command that some of the TNCs or whatever saw as the ability to go in and modify the TNC, okay, as opposed to sending traffic. So there was, another one of those things. So, like I said, practice, work out these issues. Okay, that's these are the lessons learned here in doing this. Okay, we're doing pretty good. All right, but again, like I said, we had some dedicated volunteers. They have people show up at dark 30 in the rain and set up their gear and provide this as a public service. a huge compliment to all the people that showed up here. Okay. So when do you want to do questions? If you got extensive questions, let's do the questions downstairs. We'll be down at the AREDN booth, okay, in the back. And like I said, we got plenty of time to schmooze because we're coming up to the end of our block of time here. Okay? Great. Okay, thank you.